Welcome once again back to the lab. It is your old Professor Pilk. If this is your first time, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we are going to jump in. Now, unfortunately, I haven't had an opportunity because of, various things, illnesses and stuff that's been going around. I haven't had an opportunity to finish up my builds, so let's just do a big info dump today on a bunch of different Pokemon that you can bring to tomorrow's Shiny Rayquaza raid, and we're going to start here with Noivern. Now, Noivern is probably not the perfect solution. Noivern, like most of the mon we're going to talk about today, does have one big potential downside, and that is Ice. Ice could really take this build apart. I don't think Rayquaza is going to be utilizing Ice, but it is distinctly possible, and if it is the case, then anyone that's flying in Dragon is at a distinct disadvantage. However, that is like the one potential downside to this. Everything else is such a huge deal with this. So, being that we pretty much have surmised that Rayquaza is going to have Earthquake, and obviously with the Dragon Terra, that means that Dragon moves are going to be super effective, and that does mean that most likely with a Flying Terra, you're going to be able to basically work around that Earthquake attack, which most likely is going to be buffed with a significant amount of critical damage, so you really don't want to deal with that. Plus, he's going to have his offensive buffed, and with offensive and critical rate buffed, an Earthquake could be devastating. So we kind of want to avoid that. So that's why we're going Dragon flying with a lot of these builds today. Now, Noivern normally would be a special attacker. We've gone physical attack for one big reason, and it's going to be a very similar reason with a lot of the builds we're going to talk about here. Obviously, because we do have Flying Dragon, we're going to keep a Stellar Terra here. Like I said, though, that is going to kind of open yourself up to some Ice moves, but I don't think that's going to be an overwhelming problem. Adamant Mint is going to be there because we are focusing on physical attacks, and Infiltrator ability will basically get you past some of the Reflect and other potential kind of side effects that Rayquaza could maybe, unlikely, but maybe utilize in this raid. Shell Bell, of course, because as you're doing damage, you're going to be healing, and that's really, really critical. We almost always use a Shell Bell in most of these builds, unless you're DPSing with a healing move. So, speaking of DPS, I think Dragon Claw is like the best DPS here. It is a power 80 move. It's going to hit really, really, really hard. All things considered, it's just a phenomenal move for this. Now, while special attack is a little bit higher here, we are going to use Dragon Dance and Dragon Pulse. Dragon Dance. Dragon Pulse is different. We're going to use Dragon Dance to buff ourselves up. You'll see what I mean by that here in a moment, because that's going to increase your physical attack and your speed. So I really do feel like after a couple of turns of Dragon Dancing, your physical attack will be higher than your special attack, and it does make Dragon Claw a very good late game DPS. Now, prior to getting Dragon Dance out, before you get like 2, maybe 3 of those out, you can use Dragon Pulse in the early part of this to build up your Paralysis. So 2, 3 Dragon Pulses, then maybe Dragon Dancing, and you'll be pretty good. Now, we threw Taunt on here. You don't necessarily need it, but I do feel like Rayquaza is going to have a bunch of buffing moves, and Taunt is going to give you the ability to kind of stave those off until the end of the match. So, very handy that, and as you'll notice, this is a very common build, because next we're going to talk about Alaria, another Flying Dragon, another mon that has, I think his special attack is a little bit higher on this one again, but we are going to go physical attack for the very same reasons we're doing with Noivern. And once again, because it is a Flying Dragon, we're sticking with a Stellar Terra, and just hope that Rayquaza doesn't have any Ice moves. I think he has access. I think he's got access to an Ice move. I just don't, I mean, it could be in his build. It's really hard to tell, but we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. Ability Cloud 9 will get around any kind of weather system that's in play. I don't think that's going to be a huge issue, but, it's about the only ability I can really think that would have any effect. The rest, otherwise, it really doesn't matter. Shell Bell, once again, for healing as you're doing attacks. In this case, once again, we're using Dragon Claw as our main DPS, Dragon Dance to go ahead and buff, and in this case, Dragon Cheer, because that will increase your critical rate. And a critical Dragon Claw, Dragon Danced all the way up, is going to hurt really badly. We also threw Growl on here to kind of cut down Rayquaza's physical attack, because I do feel like Rayquaza is going to buff the physical attack, so I do feel like this is pretty necessary in this build. So that is Alaria. Let's move on to Salamons. More flying dragons, guys. If you guys are enjoying these builds, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Let's get back into it because, once again, Adamant Mint, Stellar Terra. We are using Intimidate because that's going to cut down the physical attack of your opponent. You will notice that Salamons is a little light on defense, but is really, really, really high offense. And I do feel like... by the way, guys, I didn't mention EV training in the last couple, but this orange, yellow colored... not colorblind, I actually designed this myself, is this is your EV training, so you want to make sure you're always going physical attack and physical defense with all of these builds so far. Adamant Mint to get some, the extra little oomph there out of your physical attacks. Shell Bell once again for the healing. Dragon Claw once again is our main DPS. Dragon Dance for our buff. Dragon Cheer for a little bit more critical rate. And in this case, we're going to use Iron Defense to kind of improve these defensive stats. I do think that is going to be necessary, especially if Rayquaza is buffing himself. By the way, the other thing I didn't mention here at the beginning is we're assuming that everybody has basically leveled these up to level 100. You want to always use level 100 Mon in these raids, and you want to make sure that these guys are all hyper trained so that you have the perfect stats here for going into this raid. Being this is a 5-star raid, I don't know if it's super important, but this is probably going to be the hardest 5-star raid we've ever seen. Not that that says much, but better to be prepared than to just go in there and get bodied, especially when you're trying to solo a raid. But these are all for solo runs. You can use these in raids, fantastic options, but I do feel like solos are kind of just the easiest way to handle it, because there's always going to be that one person that goes, oh, it's a dragon raid. I'll bring, I don't know, a level 2 dragon. I don't know. They just get bodied. It's just really embarrassing. Like, there's just people that bring obscene things to these raids, and that's why I like to do solo runs. So some of you guys that are questioning why do we always cover solo runs, that's why. Let's talk about Dragonite. You knew Dragonite was going to be here. Another flying dragon. Come on. Adamant Mint once again. Stellar Terra once again. We're going to go ahead and EV train here like this once again. And ability multi-scale. So you know that we're going to try to keep as much health as we can. Because remember, with multi-scale, you take half the amount of damage so long as your HP is at full. So we are going to be doing a lot of dragon dancing and a lot of dragon cheering so that we basically recoup our full HP every time we attack. That way, whenever the opponent attacks, they're always hitting us with max HP, or hopefully as close as possible. But if we can keep that max HP, we can keep our opponent kind of at bay. Leer is really the only status move that I kind of thought might work pretty well here, and it is going to kind of help you keep your opponent at bay quite a bit. So all in all, very similar to the builds we had before. Now, we are going to jump into a build that has been highly talked about. You know who you are. Has been highly talked about in the comments. And that is, of course, Deany. You know who you are. I find it hilarious that my ice dragon wants to bring a rock fairy to the raid. But you know what? It 100% works. The only downside to Deany is you don't have a lot of HP and you definitely are lacking speed. But you have a lot of offense, a lot of defense. You know, this might be a bit of an exaggeration for how bad the HP and the defense is, but it definitely is not great. So all said and done, Deany is going to be a pretty interesting mod to bring to this. Probably not the best, but will be a fun run nevertheless, especially if you're like me and you've got a shiny one that you kind of want to flex. So I gave her a Fairy Terra this time only because I do feel like the Rock Terra could introduce some weaknesses, and I'd rather just have the Fairy to kind of deal with that. Now, you're not going to have Levitate or anything like that, so you are going to be able to take normal damage from the Earthquake move. But I'll be honest with you, so long as you have the Fairy Terra and so long as you Terastallize before that happens, I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. Once again, clear body, and that way you don't really get affected by a whole lot of the status effects going out there. Item Shell Bell once again. Moonblast is going to be your main DPS because you are special attacking in this situation, hence why we do the Modest Mint, and hence why the EV scale, I guess, looks like this. Reflect to kind of cut down a little bit more of that physical attack. Iron Defense to once again cut down more of that physical attack. And Fake Tears essentially just to affect your opponent in some way so that you can basically make the win happen just that much easier. So that would be my build for Deany. We'll go ahead and see how this plays out. But I really want to talk about legendaries. And we're going to start off with Zacian, or I hear him pronounced Zacian. I don't know. Whatever. It's not super important what you call him. You know, Arceus, Arceus. We all have our preferences. Don't get started in the comments, guys. Don't get started in the comments. Be civil. So, once again, another physical build. Adamant Mint. And once again, I went with a Fairy Terra, even though I've got him in this form. But I don't think he can actually be in that form. I think he has to have the item. He actually has to have the sword equipped. And I equipped him with a shell bell. So he'd be a fairy type anyway, whether or not he's going to have... Because I don't think he... I'm trying to remember, because it's been a minute since I've used this mod, I'll be totally honest. I think the sword has to be equipped for him to be in this form, but it doesn't really matter. The stats aren't insanely different. You'll be fine either way. But I just went with a Fairy Terra for simplicity's sake. Play Rough is our main DPS. Iron Head has a possible steel move that could do some damage. It's just a stab move. It's not really that big of a deal. It's not going to change anything. Really what we're looking at is Iron Defense to kind of bulk up your defense. Sword Stance to bulk up your offense. And I think it's pretty standard fare. Ability Intrepid Sword is basically going to just... It's the only ability he has at his disposal. So that just kind of is what it is. A very standard build. However, if we're talking legendaries, I think there's one legendary that actually, hands down, has the best potential in this entire event. And that is, of course, Enamoras. Very specifically, the Therian form of Enamoras. Now, Therian form Enamoras has some interesting stuff going on here. It is a flying type and a fairy type, so you are going to basically contradict almost everything that I do believe, unless I'm mistaken, I think this contradicts everything that Rayquaza could potentially bring to the table. I think this is my favorite build. Now, unfortunately, you will see the EVs, or I'm sorry, the IVs are a little bit skewed here. I actually accidentally used the wrong IVs for this. But the Therian form here has a lot of defense, a lot of offense. It is very, very good. Not quite this good, but good enough. But what really makes this form interesting is that flying type mixed with that fairy type. Throw on a Stellar Terra, and I don't think Rayquaza can really touch you with much. I think this is going to be the premium build here. It is actually going to be the best possible situation for taking on this raid, especially with a contrary ability. Because if you don't know what the contrary ability does, essentially we did this back with Malamar, where every single debuff that is applied to you becomes a buff. Hence, when you have a Stellar Terra and use Terra Blast, Terra Blast will lower your special attack and your physical attack. Except with the contrary ability, where every time you Terra Blast, it increases your special attack and your physical attack. So, doesn't matter. We're going to be buffing it either way. Springtide Storm, it has some extra abilities in there. I don't think it's probably your best, but I think Terra Blast will actually be your main DPS. But Springtide Storm, if you run out of PP in Terra Blast, will be a really, really, really good move as well. I forget what the secondary effect on that is. I know it has one. I just don't recollect it off the top of my head. But I don't know why I'm not looking it up. Let me fix that real quick. And its secondary effect, because unfortunately I did have to look it up, could actually lower your opponent's attack. So actually I take that back. Terra Blast until you're basically buffed all the way up, and then just use Springtide Storm and you'll be fine. Now it's only a 30% chance, so it's not guaranteed to do the job, but it will actually be just another kind of like event ongoing during your fight that's just going to crush Rayquaza. Another reason I think this is such a good build. Now, if you don't want to use Terra Blast at the beginning, but you still want to buff yourself up, Superpower. While it is not a stab move, and while it is not super effective, Superpower will also lower your special attack and your physical, or I'm sorry, it lowers your attack and your defense. So, essentially what's going to happen here with Superpower is that you do 2 or 3 of those right out of the gate early on. It's not going to be an insane amount of damage, but what it is going to do is it's going to buff you up, and it's going to buff up your defense and your attack while also doing damage simultaneously. Now, I also threw Taunt on here because I do feel like Rayquaza is going to do a ton of buffing himself. So Taunt right at the beginning of the match, Rayquaza will lose that ability to buff himself up. Superpower 2 or 3 or maybe even 6 times, depending on how often you're able to. Get yourself buffed up. Terrastalize, hit them with Terra Blast if you need a rebuff, or go into Springtide Storm if you don't necessarily need a rebuff, and you'll be just fine. I think this is my favorite build overall, and I think this is the one that I'm going to go into battle with more often than not, just because I think this is the one that's going to crush Rayquaza faster than anybody else. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you do so, and I'll be back with more real soon.